It was a quiet Sunday, and I sat at my sister-in-law Nina's dining room table in Nashville. The atmosphere was cozy, with laughter and soft conversation filling the air during our monthly family brunch. But there was something in my heart that wouldn't let me rest, something that made me question everything around me, including the interests of James, my husband. James looked at me with a strange smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Would you like to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" His voice seemed soft, but something in his tone made me shiver inside. In front of me, a cup of coffee gave off a peculiar, metallic aroma that made my stomach turn. Something was wrong. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but I didn't want to believe it. My mind raced in a whirlwind of thoughts. Could my husband be cheating on me? I never imagined it would come to this. At 29 years old, I found myself questioning the loyalty and security of the person I loved most. But after 3 years of marriage, many of these moments of doubt had accumulated. What had once seemed like simple accidents were now beginning to feel like a pattern. The first time I felt uneasy was months ago when, after a meal at Nina's house, I ended up in the hospital, with doctors unable to understand what had happened. They thought it was something I had eaten, but I knew it wasn't just spoiled food. Sitting at the table, trying to ignore my growing fear, I forced a smile. "Oh, how kind of you," I replied, but my mind was on fire, trying to understand what was happening. Nina's words cut through the air. "James has been practicing different cooking methods, just for you," she said, with a smile that seemed to hide something. I watched closely, feeling each word like a blow. My mind wondered, what if this was the last smile? What if today's smile was the one that really hid the answers to all my questions? I tried to maintain my composure, but I knew something wasn't right. Then an opportunity arose. Quickly, but in a controlled manner, I got up from the table, feigning an excuse. "Oh, I'm going to make a quick connection. You don't mind, do you?" I wanted to get out of that environment. I was going to find out the truth. My mind was racing, and my body was shaking as I walked through the door to Nina's study. But in the midst of the confusion, I managed to switch the coffee cups. My hand shook slightly, but no one noticed. Only I knew how urgent it was. I stood at the study door watching. My heart was pounding. With each passing second, the tension grew, until Nina calmly picked up a cup of coffee. A cold sensation ran down my spine. I knew what was about to happen. I didn't want it to happen, but I needed the truth. What would you do if you knew everything? What would you do if the betrayal was right before my eyes? And it was at that moment, as Nina sipped her coffee, that everything unfolded. She stopped suddenly, her expression changing to one of uncontrollable terror. The fear lingered like fire, and I knew in that instant that I was right. James, terror in his eyes, ran toward her, his chair crashing to the floor. "No, what did you do? What happened?" he stammered, the panic in his voice no longer hiding. And in the silence of the room, an uncomfortable truth emerged, clear as day. I had been recording everything on my phone, the video that could not be turned off, the proof of everything I had suspected. And as James tried to deny it, as Nina fell to the floor, shaking, I knew that this was the turning point. This was the truth I had been searching for so long. I could no longer ignore it. I could no longer live in doubt. What had started as small warning signs would now become an avalanche. And deep down, a sense of liberation washed over me. Have you ever had a feeling that something was not right, but didn't know where to start? Have you ever had the power to change the rumor mill in your story, but been paralyzed by fear or doubt? Sometimes the only way to find the truth is to face it head-on, with courage and determination. And I want to hear from you. What were the moments in your life when you decided to face what was eating you up inside? Share your story in the comments. Let's go on this journey of discovery and empowerment together. Chaos was unfolding before me, but I couldn't look away. James, standing next to Nina, panicked. Their carefully orchestrated plan had failed spectacularly. He was now selling the truth as it crumbled like a house of cards, and I was recording it all. In a firm voice, I spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, we need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive. My sister-in-law seems to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee." The words were coming out of my mouth, but my body was in turmoil. I knew with a terrifying certainty that this was no coincidence. This was no paranoia. There was a pattern. Something was happening that could no longer be ignored. As she spoke, Nina stared at me with wide eyes. A look of fear etched on her face, replacing the usual calculating look I knew so well. "Christina," she tried to say, choking on the words. Did you switch the cups? Did you know?" I didn't hesitate. Yes, I did. The truth I had feared so much loomed before me like a wall. I wasn't just suspicious. I knew what was happening. In that moment, everything made sense. Last month's tea, the breakfast incident, the little accidents that, over time, had revealed themselves to be deliberate attempts. I was no longer fighting the shadows of my doubts alone. I was now at war, and the truth was my greatest ally. Nina's face contorted again, pain taking over her as she clutched her stomach, trying to keep herself upright. The tea that was supposed to keep me home during Johnson's contract presentation, but you went anyway, she whispered, her words broken with agony. And suddenly, the final piece of the puzzle fell away. I knew exactly what was happening. I knew that what they wanted was for me to fail. They wanted to see me out of the picture, to defeat me in some insidious way, without even having to lift a hand. They had planned to bring me down, using what I loved and trusted most. The food and drink we shared, the family gatherings, the moments that should have been bonding but were now tainted by a cruel betrayal. But no longer. I stood firm. The sound of sirens cut through the air, and the paramedics arrived to take Nina to the hospital. James stood frozen, watching his plan collapse. And in that moment I made a decision. I would not only ensure that Nina was treated properly, but that the evidence was recorded irrefutably. I knew that by recording everything, I had the power to expose the truth. At the hospital, as the doctors treated Nina, I braced myself in the waiting room, my phone in hand, playing the recording of Nina's confession over and over. The panic in her voice, the pain she was in, it was all proof that my suspicions had been valid. Then a nurse called me over. "Nina Anderson's family?" she asked, and I stood up, noticing James's absence. He had said he was going to park the car, but he hadn't returned. My instincts told me he was trying to evade the truth. I followed the nurse to Nina's room, where Dr. Phillips, a tall, serious woman, was waiting for me. "Mrs. Bennett, can you tell me what happened before your sister-in-law got sick?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. I took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment. I needed to make sure the truth was heard. "I think you should hear this first," I said, as the recording of the brunch played. I watched the doctor's expression change before my eyes. Concern gave way to alarm. "This is very serious," Dr. Phillips said, starting to jot down notes. "The substance we found is not something that accidentally ends up in coffee. We are looking at deliberate contamination." I knew the storm was just beginning, but I was ready to face whatever came. I had the evidence. I had the strength, and now the truth was being exposed for all to see. It was then that James appeared, his face pale and sweaty, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Christina, let me explain. This is all a misunderstanding," he began, trying to get closer to me. But Dr. Phillips firmly asked him to step back. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out the messages I had found on his phone from my pocket, the ones I knew would be the key to debunking the whole lie. "Were those messages between you and Nina about making sure she was out of commission just friendly?" I asked, my voice calm but full of determination. James froze. Their plan was exposed. I knew the truth could no longer be denied. "What about you? Have you ever faced times when you had to fight for the truth? Have you ever been faced with a betrayal so profound that you had to summon all your courage to expose the truth? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, justice, and twists, and turns that you won't want to miss. The room was silent, tense, with only the sound of everyone breathing. James was trapped in a corner, his expression a mix of despair and terror. He already knew that what had seemed like a perfect plan had crumbled, and with it, his entire facade of control. But I couldn't feel sorry for him, not after everything he'd done. I looked at Dr. Phillips, who was standing next to me, his expression serious. "This coffee, this dinner, it was all an attempt to bring me down," I said, my voice firm, each word filled with the truth I had finally accepted. He looked at me, surprised, but also understanding. Fear no longer dominated me. The truth was out in the open, and nothing could erase it. I had learned the hard way that sometimes the real battle isn't against the people who betray us, but against our own ability to see the truth and take action. For months, I had ignored the signs. The small stomach aches, the unexplainable reactions, the moments when my body asked me to stop, but I simply ignored it. Now the truth was there for all to see, and there was no turning back. Detective Mendoza arrived at an unrelenting pace, his presence commanding respect. She looked at me with the wisdom of someone who had seen many stories like mine, but what was about to happen, no one could have predicted. She knew that the lie was crumbling, and with it, James and Nina had no way to escape. James, his eyes empty of fear, tried once again to explain the inexplicable, but there was no more room for excuses. "I was just trying to help you," he said, but the words seemed empty, as if he knew deep down that he had already crossed a line that could not be undone. I looked at him without a shred of compassion. "You weren't helping me, James. You were trying to destroy me. And now the truth is coming out." The detective calmly and precisely laid it all out. Their plans, their attempt to sabotage my career, their attempt to bring me down at any cost. The recordings, the messages, the evidence were all there. It wasn't paranoia, as they had tried to make me believe. It was reality, cruel and relentless. Now my head was clear. The fear I had felt before had transformed into a powerful force. I was in control of my life, of my destiny. No matter how much they tried to break me, I wouldn't let them win. The detective's voice cut through the air. "This isn't protection, Mr. Bennett. This is attempted murder." The words echoed like a warning to everyone. The truth could no longer be hidden. I knew that from that moment on, my life would never be the same. But instead of fear, I felt a deep peace. The peace that comes when you finally understand that you don't have to be a victim of circumstances. You can change the game. You can turn the tables. The detective then turned to me with a look that said it all. "Now, Christina, you will have justice. The truth is with you." And in that moment, something changed in me. I was no longer the woman who was afraid to face the truth. I was someone stronger, more determined. And I knew that justice, the one I had sought so much, was finally within my reach. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been through something like this, where you had to face the truth and betrayal? How did you feel when the mask of the person you trusted fell? Share your story in the comments and subscribe for more stories of overcoming and transformation. Because the truth always comes to light, and it is in it that we find our strength. As she reviewed the test results, Detective Mendoza and I walked forward, while James remained outside, flanked by the guards. Not tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, but the tremors had not yet completely subsided. Dr. Phillips announced in her calm, authoritative voice that the toxicology report showed elevated levels of several substances. The most concerning was the presence of a specific compound commonly used in pharmaceutical testing, something the general public should not have access to. Not paled at this. "That's impossible," James exclaimed, trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation. "It was just something to cause mild symptoms." "Mild symptoms?" Detective Mendoza interrupted, pulling out his notebook. "Like the symptoms your sister-in-law has been experiencing for the past 6 months?" Just then, the door opened and another detective walked in, holding an evidence bag. "We found this on the desk in Mr. Bennett's office at Anderson, the marketing firm," he announced. Several small vials with clinical labels, along with detailed notes on dosages and reactions. I felt my knees weaken as I realized the scope of their plan. "You were documenting everything as if it were an experiment?" I asked, anger rising inside me. Not tried to protest, but her voice wavered. "We just needed to track what worked. The first few attempts weren't effective enough." She tried to justify herself, but her words were falling apart. "So you increased the dosages?" Detective Mendoza concluded, examining the vials. "Did you know these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations?" The silence in the room was heavy. I glanced out the window and saw James slumped in a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "The Henderson account," I said slowly. "It wasn't just about that presentation. It was that you wanted to get me out of the way permanently because the client chose me as their leader." Now couldn't hide the anger and fear on her face. "You were ruining everything. I've been building up that client base for years, and then you show up, and suddenly everyone wants to work with you," she screamed, frustration boiling over. James had merely said he could fix everything by eliminating me, but his words hung in the air, thick with accusation. "We weren't trying to," Na began to justify herself, but Dr. Phillips cut her off. "The concentration of coffee you consumed today," she said, looking directly at Na, "was significantly higher than in the previous samples we analyzed. If you had consumed it, the results would have been serious, possibly fatal." Detective Mendoza turned to another officer. "We'll need a full warrant for both of your homes and offices, and we'll also need to contact the pharmaceutical company responsible for these substances." Na slumped back against her pillows, the fight draining from her face. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered, her eyes full of despair. James kept insisting that one more try would be enough. I approached her bedside, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Every time I was sick, every meeting I lost clients. I lost you too. You were there, watching, taking notes on how the poison was affecting me. What kind of person does that?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear James being read his rights as other officers arrived. Na stared down at her hands, unable to look at me. "Detective," I said, pulling away from my sister-in-law. "I'm ready to make my formal statement. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but it felt like years. I'd been in the courtroom every day, watching as the prosecution meticulously laid out their case against James and Na. The evidence was overwhelming. Vials found in James's office, his notes about attempted poisonings, recordings of conversations, and text messages discussing the plans. Na's demeanor made a profound impression on me. Normally so polite and confident, she seemed dwarfed in the defendant's chair. James couldn't even look at me, his eyes fixed on the floor. The witnesses detailed the potentially lethal effects of the substances used, and Dr. Phillips' testimony was particularly damning. She presented a detailed analysis showing how the dosages had been increased over time, clearly showing intent to cause serious harm. The pharmaceutical company representative confirmed that James had stolen the compounds through a college friend who worked in the research department. The prosecutor argued in her closing statement that this was not just corporate sabotage, but a systematic attempt to harm Ms. Bennett, an escalation that could have resulted in death. When the verdict was read, I felt not joy, but only relief. James and Na were found guilty on multiple charges, including attempted murder and conspiracy. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom. The premeditated nature of these actions, carried out against a family member over a long period of time, demands the maximum sentence. I watched them being led away, handcuffed, and thought about how greed and jealousy had twisted 2 people I had once trusted beyond recognition. Their businesses, their reputations, their freedom, all sacrificed in an attempt to destroy me. A year after the trial, I stood at the podium at the Nashville Business Leaders Conference, about to give the keynote address. The irony was not lost on me. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Na had tried to keep me from achieving. The Henderson account she and James had tried to steal had led to many other major clients, establishing me as one of the top marketing executives in the region. Success isn't just about talent or hard work. It's about integrity, I said, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. It's about building genuine relationships based on trust. I paused, letting my words sink in. Sometimes the biggest threats to our success come from those closest to us, but surviving those challenges makes us stronger. After my speech, several young professionals approached me, seeking advice. One woman, her eyes shining with determination, asked me how I had managed to maintain my composure during the ordeal. I smiled and replied, "I focused on what I could control. I gathered the evidence, trusted my instincts, and refused to let fear stop me from pursuing my goals." Later that evening, I received an email from Henderson's client confirming that they were renewing the contract for another 3 years. I smiled, thinking about how things might have turned out differently if I hadn't trusted my instincts that day at brunch. That morning, the local paper had run a short article about Na and James starting their prison sentences. I didn't read it. Instead, I focused on the proposal for my latest client project. I knew that the best revenge wasn't about getting even, but about moving forward and succeeding despite those who try to hold us back.